The concluding pages of the anatomy lesson. A broken jaw. It was dark in Chicago when the plastic surgeon arrived. He apologized for being late, but he'd driven in through the blizzard from Homewood. He sewed him up right in the room, stitched him up from inside the flesh so there'd be nothing afterwards but a hairline scar. "If you want," he said, a joke to lift the patient's spirits, "we'll take another tuck right here and nip that dewlap in the bud. Keep you young for the ladies." Whether he was given a local anesthetic, Zuckerman had no idea. Maybe everything just hurt too much for him to feel the stitching. The X-rays showed a fracture of the jaw in 2 places, so the maxillofacial surgeon was called down, and at about the dinner hour, Zuckerman was wheeled into the operating room. The elderly surgeon explained everything beforehand, in the quietest voice, like the TV announcer at the tennis match, described for Zuckerman what was next. 2 fractures, he explained. An oblique fracture at the front, a thin vertical line running from between where the teeth had broken off down to the point of the chin, and a second fracture up by the hinge. Because the fragments weren't in a very good position running down to the chin, he'd have to make a small incision just beneath the chin to go in and get them aligned, then take very fine wire, drill some holes, and wire the bone together. Up by the hinge, no surgery necessary. They'd put metal bars on his upper and lower teeth, crisscross rubber bands to hold the bars fastened together, and that's all it would take to heal the second fracture and give him an even bite. He shouldn't be alarmed when he woke up if he experienced a slight choking sensation. It would only be from the rubber bands clamping his mouth more or less shut. They would be loosening that up as soon as they could. And then, for the 20th time that day, Zuckerman was assured that after his face was all fixed, he'd still be able to wow the girls. "Yes, it's a clean fracture, but not quite clean enough to suit me." These words of the surgeon's were the last that Zuckerman heard. Bobby, there to administer the anesthesia, patted his shoulder. "Off to Xanadu, Zook." And off he went, to the tune of "Not Quite Clean Enough." Bobby was there to put him out, and was there in the recovery room to check up on him when Zuckerman came to. But when the xylocaine wore off sometime during the night, Zuckerman was alone, and at long last he found out just what pain could really do. He'd had no idea. One of the maneuvers he adopted to get from one minute to the next was to try calling himself Mr. Zuckerman, as though from the bench. "Chasing that old man around those tombstones, Mr. Zuckerman, is the dumbest thing you have ever done. You have opened the wrong windows, closed the wrong doors. You have granted jurisdiction over your conscience to the wrong court. You have been in hiding half your life and a son far too long. You, Mr. Zuckerman, have been the most improbable slave to embarrassment and shame. Yet for sheer, pointless, inexcusable stupidity, nothing comes close to chasing across a cemetery, through a snowstorm, a retired handbag salesman, understandably horrified to discover grafted upon his own family tree the goy who spoils everything. To fix all that pain and repression and exhaustion on this Katzenjammer Karamazov, this Bush League Pontifex, to smash him like some false divinity into smithereens. But of course there were Gregory's inalienable rights to defend, the liberties of a repellent, mindless little shit whom you, Mr. Zuckerman, would loathe on sight. It appears, Mr. Zuckerman, that you may have lost your way since Thomas Mann last looked down from the altar and charged you to become a great man. I hereby sentence you to a mouth clamped shut." When the light-hearted approach proved ineffective, and then the distraction of reciting to himself what he could remember from high school of the Canterbury Tales, he held his own hand, pretending that it was somebody else. His brother, his mother, his father, his wives, each took a turn sitting beside the bed and holding his hand in theirs. The pain was amazing. If he could have opened his mouth, he would have screamed. After 5 hours, if he could have got himself to the window, he would have jumped. And after 10 hours, the pain began to subside. For the next few days he was nothing but a broken mouth. He sucked through a straw and he slept. That was it. Sucking would seem to be the easiest thing in the world to do, something nobody had to be taught. But because his lips were so bruised and sore and the overall swelling so bad, and because the straw only fit sideways into his mouth, he couldn't even suck right, and had to sort of draw in from down in the stomach to get the stuff to begin to trickle through him. In this way he sucked in carrot soup and mushed up fruit, and a milky drink, banana-flavored and extolled as highly nutritious, that was so sweet it made him gag. When he wasn't sucking liquid pulp or sleeping, he went exploring his mouth with his tongue. Nothing existed but the inside of his mouth. He made all sorts of discoveries in there. Your mouth is who you are. You can't get very much closer to what you think of as yourself. The next stop up is the brain. No wonder Philario has achieved such renown. Your tongue lives in your mouth, and your tongue is you. He sent his tongue everywhere to see what was doing beyond the metal arch bars and the elastic bands. Across the raw, vaulted dome of the palate, down to the tender, cavernous sockets of the missing teeth, and then the plunge below the gum line. That was where they'd opened him up and wired him together. For the tongue, it was like the journey up the river in Heart of Darkness, the mysterious stillness, the miles of silence, the tongue creeping Conradianly on toward Kurtz. I am the Marlowe of my mouth. Below the gum line, there had been bits of jawbone and teeth smashed up, and the doctor had spent some time, before setting the fracture, picking around in there to take out all the tiny fragments. Giving him new front teeth was still to come. He couldn't imagine ever again biting into anything. The idea of anyone touching his face was horrible. He slept at one point for 18 hours and afterwards had no recollection of having his blood pressure taken or his IV changed. A young night nurse came by to cheer him up with the Chicago Tribune. "Well," she said, flushed a little with excitement, "you really are somebody, aren't you?" He motioned for her to leave the paper beside his sleeping pill. In the middle of the night, some night or other, he finally picked up the copy she'd left him and looked at it under the bedlight. The paper was folded back to an item in one of the columns. Latest from our celebrity chauffeur, How Time Jets. 60s rebel novelist Nathan Karnofsky Zuckerman recouping at Billings from cosmetic surgery. Just a nip and a tuck for the 40-ish Romeo, then back to Elaine's in the New York scene. Nathan slipped into town incognito to party at the pump room on the eve of the lift. A card arrived for Mr. Freitag. On the envelope's return address sticker, where it read Mr. and Mrs. Harry Freitag, Mr. Freitag had put a line through, and Mrs. Drawing that line would have taken some doing. The card read, "Hurry and get well." On the back he had written a personal message. "Dear Nathan, Bobby explained about the death of your beloved parents that I did not know about. Your terrible grief as a son explains whatever happened, and nothing more has to be added. The cemetery was the last place in the world for you to be. I only kick myself that I didn't know beforehand. I hope I didn't make it worse with anything I said. You have made a great name in life, for which all my congratulations. But I want you to know you are still Joel Kupperman, the quiz kid, to Bobby's dad and always will be. Hurry and get well. Love from the Freitags, Harry, Bobby, and Greg." The last of the old-fashioned fathers. And we, thought Zuckerman, the last of the old-fashioned sons. Who that follows after us will understand how midway through the 20th century, in this huge, lax, disjointed democracy, a father, and not even a father of learning or eminence or demonstrable power, could still assume the stature of a father in a Kafka story. No, the good old days are just about over, when half the time, without even knowing it, a father could sentence a son to punishment for his crimes, and the love and hatred of authority could be such a painful, tangled mess. There was a letter from the student paper, the Maroon. The editors wanted to interview him about the future of his kind of fiction in the post-modernist era of John Barth and Thomas Pynchon. Since they understood that because of his surgery he might not wish to be seen, would he please answer at whatever length he chose the 10 questions on the sheet attached. Well, they were kind not to show up and just grill him on the spot. He didn't feel ready quite yet for the social pleasures of an author's life. 1. Why do you continue to write? 2. What purpose does your work serve? 3. Do you feel yourself part of a rearguard action in the service of a declining tradition? 4. Has your sense of vocation altered significantly because of the events of the last decade? Yes, yes, said Zuckerman, very much so, and dropped back below the gum line. The 4th morning he got up and looked in the mirror. Until then he hadn't been interested. Very pale, very drawn. Surgical tape under his chin. Hollow cheeks that a movie star would envy, and around the surgical tape a scraggly growth of beard that had come in all white. And bolder. 4 days in Chicago had undone 4 months of trichological treatment. The swelling had subsided, but the jaw was alarmingly lopsided, and even through the whiskers looked badly bruised, mulberry like a birthmark. His cracked and spotted lips had also turned colors, and 2 teeth were indeed gone. He realized that his glasses were gone. Under the snow in the cemetery, buried till spring with Bobby's mother. All the better. For now he didn't care to see clearly the clever jokes that mockery plays. He'd been considered a great mocker once himself, but never as diabolically inspired as this. Even without the aid of his glasses, he understood that he didn't look like he was on the ball. He thought, just don't make me write about it after. Not everything has to be a book, not that, too. But back in bed he thought, the burden isn't that everything has to be a book, it's that everything can be a book, and doesn't count as life until it is. Then the euphoria of convalescence and the loosening of his rubber bands. During the weeks that followed the successful operation, in the excitement of giving up each day a little more of the narcotic support, full of the pleasure of learning for the second time in 40 years to form simple monosyllabic English with his lips and his palate and his tongue and his teeth, he wandered the hospital in his robe and slippers and the new white beard. Nothing he pronounced in his weakened voice felt time-worn. All the words seemed rapturously clean, and the oral catastrophe behind him. He tried to forget all that had happened in the limousine, at the cemetery, on the plane. He tried to forget everything that had happened since he'd come out to go to school here the first time. I was 16, intoning shanti, shanti, shanti on the L. That's the last I remember. The first-year interns, young men in their mid-20s, mustaches newly cultivated and eyes darkly circled from working days and nights, came around to his room after supper to introduce themselves and chat. They struck him as artless, innocent children. It was as though, leaving the platform with their medical school diplomas, they'd taken a wrong turn and fallen back headlong into the 2nd grade. They brought their copies of Karnofsky for him to autograph and solemnly asked if he was working on a new book. What Zuckerman wanted to know was the age of the oldest member of their medical school class. He began helping the post-operative patients just up out of bed, slowly wheeling along the corridor, the poles slung with their IV bags. 12 times around, moaned a forlorn man of 60 with a freshly bandaged head. Dark, pigmented moles could be seen at the base of his spine, where the ties to his gown had come undone. 12 times around the floor, he told Zuckerman. Supposed to be a mile. Well, said Zuckerman through a rigid jaw, you don't have to do the mile today. I own a seafood restaurant. You like fish? Love it. He'll come when you're better. Al's Dock, where lobsters are the main thing, spelled M-A-I-N-E. You'll have dinner on me, everything fresh that day. One thing I learned, you can't serve frozen fish. There are people who can tell the difference, and you can't get away with it. You have got to serve fresh fish. The only thing we have that's frozen is the shrimp. What do you do? Oh, God, should I now do my number? No, in their weakened condition too alarming for both of them. Donning that mask wasn't a joke. All the while he was enjoying it, his exuberant performance was making even more unrelenting all the ghosts and the rages. What looked like a new obsession to exercise the old obsessions was only the old obsessions merrily driving him as far as he could go. As far? Don't bet on it. Plenty more turmoil where that came from. Out of work, said Zuckerman. A bright young guy like you? Zuckerman shrugged. Temporary setback, that's all. Well, you ought to learn the seafood business. Could be, said Zuckerman. You're young. And with those words, the restaurateur was choking back tears, suddenly fighting down the convalescent's pity for all vulnerable things, including himself now and his bandaged head. I can't tell you what it was like, he said. Close to death, you can't understand how it draws you to life. You survive, he said, and you see it all new, everything. And 6 days later, he had a hemorrhage and died. The sobbing of a woman, and Zuckerman was transfixed outside her room. He was wondering what, if anything, he should do. What is the matter? What does she need? When a nurse popped out and rushed right past him, muttering only half to herself, "Some people think you're going to torture them." Zuckerman peered inside. He saw the graying hair spread across her pillow, and a paperback copy of David Copperfield open on the sheet that covered her chest. She was about his age, and wearing a pale blue nightgown of her own. The delicate shoulder straps looked absurdly fetching. She might have been lying down to rest for a moment before rushing off to a dinner party on a summer evening. "Is there anything—" "This cannot be!" she shouted. He came farther into the room. "What is it?" he whispered. "They're removing my larynx," she cried. "Go away!" In the lounge at the end of the ear, nose, and throat floor, he checked the relatives of the surgical patients waiting for the results. He sat and waited with them. Always somebody at the card table playing solitaire. All there was to worry about, yet not one forgot to give the deck a good shuffle before dealing a new game. One afternoon, Walsh, his emergency room doctor, found him there in the lounge, on his lap a yellow pad where he'd been able to write nothing more than, "Dear Jenny." Dear Diana, dear Yaga, dear Gloria. Mostly he sat crossing out words that were wrong in every possible way. Overwrought, self-contempt, weary of treatment, the mania of sickness, the reign of error, hypersensitized to all the inescapable limits, engrossed to the exclusion of everything else. Nothing would flow with any reality. A mannered, stilted letter voice, aping tones of great sincerity and expressing, if anything, his great reservations about writing to explain it all. He couldn't be intelligent about having failed to make good as a man on his back, and he could not be apologetic or ashamed. Wasn't emotionally persuasive any longer. Yet, as soon as he sat down to write, out came another explanation, causing him to recoil from his words in disgust. The same with the books. However ingenious and elaborate the disguise, answering charges, countering allegations, angrily sharpening the conflict while earnestly striving to be understood. The endless public deposition, what a curse! The best reason of all never to write again. While they rode the down elevator, Walsh savored the last of his cigarette. Savoring, Zuckerman thought, some contempt for me, too. "Who set your jaw finally?" Walsh asked. Zuckerman told him. "Nothing but the best," said Walsh. "Know how he rose to the white-haired heights? Studied years ago with the big guy in France. Experimented on monkeys. Wrote it all up. Bashed in their faces with a baseball bat and then studied the fracture lines. To then write it up, even more barbaric than what went on in his line. Is that true? Is that how he got to the Heights? Don't ask me. Gordon Walsh never got to do much bashing. How about the $5 habit, Mr. Zuckerman? Remove you from your Percodan yet? So far, so good, reported Zuckerman on the subject of his habit. Well, Walsh replied, we'll see when you're out from under surveillance. No armed robber breaks into a bank while still a guest of the state. That happens the week he gets sprung. At the ground floor, they left the elevator and started down the corridor to the emergency ward. We just admitted a woman of 88. Ambulance went to get her 81-year-old brother, a stroke. They took one whiff and brought her along, too. What'd they smell? You'll see. The woman had only half a face. One cheek, up to the eye socket, and the whole side of her jaw had been eaten away by cancer. Ever since it had begun as just a blister 4 years before, she had been treating it on her own with mercurochrome and dressing it with a bandage that she changed once a week. She lived with her brother in one room, cooked for him and cleaned for him, and no neighbor, no shopkeeper, no one who saw it had ever looked under the bandage and called a doctor. She was a slight, shy, demure, well-spoken old woman, poor but a lady, and when Zuckerman came in alongside of Walsh, she pulled her hospital nightie around her bare throat. She lowered her eyes. How do you do, sir? Walsh introduced his companion. This is Dr. Zuckerman, our resident humanist. He'd like to take a look, Mrs. Brentford. Zuckerman was dressed in the hospital robe and slippers, and his beard was as yet without distinction. He lacked 2 front teeth and had a mouth full of metal. Yet the woman said, "Oh, yes, thank you." To Zuckerman, Walsh explained the case. "We've been cutting the scabs away and draining pus for an hour. All cleaned up for you, Doc." He led the resident humanist to the far side of the bed and shined a pocket light on the wound. There was a hole in her cheek the size of a quarter. Through it, Zuckerman could see her tongue as it nervously skittered about inside her mouth. The jawbone itself was partially exposed, an inch of it as white and clean as enamel tile. The rest, up to the eye socket, was a chunk of raw flesh, something off the butcher's floor to cut up for the cat. He tried not to inhale the smell. Out in the hallway, Walsh was racked with the cough ignited by his laughter. "You look green, Doctor," he said when finally he could speak. "Maybe you're better off sticking to books." By mid-morning each day, the large canvas bins along the corridor were stuffed with the night's soiled linen. Zuckerman had been eyeing these bins for weeks, each time he passed beside one, tempted by the strangest yearning. It was on the morning after Walsh's caper, when there was no one anywhere nearby to ask what the hell he thought he was doing, that finally he plunged his arms down through the tangle of sheets and bedwear and towels. He never expected so much to be so damp. The strength rushed from his groin, his mouth filled with bile. It was as though he were up to his elbows in blood. It was as though the reeking flesh of Mrs. Brentford's face was there between his 2 hands. Down the corridor, he heard a woman begin to howl. Somebody's mother or sister or daughter, the cry of a survivor. She pinched us. She hit us. The names that she called us. Then she went. Another catastrophe. Every moment, behind every wall, right next door, the worst ordeals that anyone could imagine. Pain that was ruthless and inescapably real. Crying and suffering truly worthy of all a man's defiance. He would become Mrs. Brentford's physician. He would become a maxillofacial surgeon. He would study anesthesiology. He would run a detoxification program, setting his patients the example of his own successful withdrawal. Until someone down the corridor shouted, "Hey, you! You all right?" Zuckerman remained submerged to his shoulders in the sheets of the healing, the ailing, and the dying, and of whoever had died there during the night. His hope as deep as the abiding claim of his remote but unrelinquishable home. This is life, with real teeth in it. From that evening on, Whenever the interns dropped by to say hello, he asked to accompany them on their rounds. In every bed, the fear was different. What the doctor wanted to know, the patient told him. Nobody's secret a scandal or a disgrace. Everything revealed and everything at stake. And always the enemy was wicked and real. "We had to give you a little haircut to get that all cleaned out." "Oh, that's all right," the enormous baby-faced black woman replied in a small, compliant voice. The intern gently turned her head. "Was it very deep, Doctor?" "We got it all," the intern told her, showing Zuckerman the long, stitched-up wound under the oily dressing just behind her ear. "Nothing there to worry you any more." "Yes? Well, that's good then." "Absolutely. And am I going to see you again?" "You sure are," he said, squeezing her hand. And then he left her at peace on her pillow, with Zuckerman, the intern's intern, in tow. What a job! The paternal bond to those in duress, the urgent, immediate human exchange. All this indispensable work to be done, all this digging away at disease. And he'd given his fanatical devotion to sitting with a typewriter alone in a room. For nearly as long as he remained a patient, Zuckerman roamed the busy corridors of the university hospital, patrolling and planning on his own by day, then out on the quiet floor with the interns at night, as though he still believed that he could unchain himself from a future as a man apart and escape the corpus that was his.